If you've gotten this far in the ecology playlist, you may well be wondering, are humans an equilibrial or an opportunistic species? Take a moment and think about it. Think about what we've learned about the rules for each of these two categories and make your decision. If we were to go on behavior alone, we would say that humans are an equilibrial species. We are complicated, large-bodied organisms that take over a decade to reach sexual maturity. We generally only have 1 or 2 children at a time, even though over the course of a lifetime we might have 7 or 8. And regardless of how many children we have, we take very good care of them for a long period of time, upwards of 25 to 30 years from what I'm told. So you would be correct in saying that humans are an equilibrial species. However, if you take a look at the human growth curve over the past couple of 100 years, it tells a slightly different story. The bars on this graph represent the total population increase year by year, whereas the red line indicates the total population size. And as you can see, we have a J-shaped exponential growth curve, and that is what you would expect of an opportunistic species. And yet, we definitively behave like an equilibrial species. So what's going on here? What's happening is that any species, remember, any species at all that is given ideal conditions will exhibit exponential growth. So the human population curve is doing what you would expect for a population with no limiting factors. Now, prior to 350 years ago or so, the human population stayed right below 1 billion humans, and that's what it had been for a very, very long time. So our carrying capacity was somewhere beneath 1 billion humans. But sometime around the 1700s, the population growth started to spike upward. So have we dramatically overshot our carrying capacity in such a way that we are going to have a profound population crash in the near future that will devastate the planet? No, probably not. What's actually happened is we raised the carrying capacity. We brought it up to a new height, and we haven't reached it yet. So we are behaving in just the same way that you would expect any natural population to behave if its population is less than its carrying capacity. We are growing. And in fact, the rate of growth has dropped off since the 1960s. So the population growth rate is already starting to slow down, and we are starting to see the logistic growth curve start to take shape. We're starting to see that nice S-shaped curve. So even though if we take a look at the human population clock, that we are at just shy of 7.8 billion humans while I'm recording this April of 2020, there is no need to worry about us overshooting our carrying capacity and seeing a Malthusian-style population crash. Now, we're not totally sure what our new carrying capacity is going to look like. Maybe it's 9 billion humans, maybe 10 billion, maybe 12 billion humans, but we definitely do have a carrying capacity, and as we approach it, our population growth is starting to slow down. Now, how did humans raise their own carrying capacity? Well, we did it through technology and through knowledge and through different social mechanisms. So, for example, we developed agricultural practices that dramatically increased the amount of food available. Food scarcity is not an issue in developed regions. And even in undeveloped regions, the problem is transporting food to the people that need it. It's not a problem of global production. It's a slightly uncomfortable fact to be aware of that we produce more food than is needed by all 7.8 billion humans on the planet. The problem is, in developed regions, we actually throw away about 40% of the food that we produce. A lot of it is not sold from the grocery store, so it gets thrown out. Some of it never actually makes it to the grocery store. It gets thrown out on the farms because it hasn't met some arbitrary quality standard. Some of it moves past an expiration date, which is only a suggestion to begin with. Sometimes we just don't eat it off of our plate. So about 40% of the food that we produce in the United States never gets eaten by anyone. If we were to distribute all the food that is grown on Earth evenly to all the people, everyone would have enough food to eat. But at least as it stands right now, that's virtually economically impossible to actually accomplish. I'm not going to go into the economics of food production and distribution here, but once again, pitch for my Humans in the Environment class. Sanitation is another huge reason why we've increased our own carrying capacity. We didn't used to wash our hands with soap on a regular basis. We didn't used to take showers more than once or twice every few months. We didn't know that if an animal dies in the street, like if you have a horse and you're riding it, that maybe you should take it somewhere else and not just leave it to rot in that location. And those animals left their droppings in the street, but that wasn't alone, because we used to just dump our chamber pots into either cesspools or directly into the street gutters as well. The world used to be a great deal more disgusting, to put it lightly, and diseases spread much more easily under that situation. So simply washing our hands, washing ourselves, having public health initiatives out there has all contributed to helping us avoid dying of preventable illnesses. And on the subject of illnesses, we have improved our healthcare abilities pretty substantially. We can now use imaging technology to look inside of someone without needing to cut them open. If someone does need surgery, the surgery actually increases their likelihood of surviving, as opposed to a couple hundred years ago where it was basically a death sentence and it was a better idea to just ignore the fact that you were sick than go to any doctor. We stopped believing that all illnesses come from breathing in bad odors, miasma theory, or that it comes from an imbalance of 4 humors inside your body, which led to practices like bloodletting. We improved our understanding of human anatomy and physiology by cutting open cadavers and looking inside and then writing down what we saw, an idea which took a shockingly long time to catch on in the medical community. We have vaccines, we have antibiotics, we have medicines, we have anesthetics. We have prosthetics that are so good that a former vice president of ours didn't have a functioning heart for 2 years while a pump did the work for it, and then he finally got a heart transplant. So our ability to heal the sick has dramatically increased. So what does this mean? Nutrition means that there's enough food for people to eat. Sanitation means that we've removed a lot of the preventable diseases. And healthcare means that we've taken a lot of things that would have been inconceivable to prevent, heart failure and a lot of times cancer treatment and these kind of things, and we actually are able to let people live long, healthy lives, even considering that. So all of the limiting factors that were keeping our population down, they've now been removed, and we are seeing that exponential growth rate. Now, does that mean that there is nothing to worry about with the human population growth rate whatsoever? No, it does not mean that. Because that overall population growth rate is an average of all of the different locations across the planet. If you compare more developed countries like the United States, Japan, Great Britain, Sweden, all of these countries that are more technologically and economically developed, the population growth rate is very, very low. In those areas that are less developed, places like India and some of the other poorer countries across the planet, population growth is actually still substantially high. So on this table, you can see more developed countries have an annual growth rate of 0.2%, whereas less developed countries have an annual growth rate of 1.5%. Now that 1.3% difference, what big deal is that? But in terms of population growth, it actually is a pretty big deal. If we take a calculator, we can use something called the rule of 70 to figure out exactly how long it will be before these populations are expected to double. So you take the number 70 and you divide it by the population growth rate, 0.2, and you would find that developed countries, their populations will probably double in about 350 years. Now that's assuming that the growth rate remains constant. However, if you hop in the same calculation and you take a look at less developed countries, you find that it'll take about 47 years for their population to double. And these are already the areas that have the fewest resources and the most people. So doubling those populations over the next 50 years, that's going to cause a lot of stress. However, there is some good news because we've discovered that as countries steadily become more developed, their population growth rate starts to drop off. So this graph actually shows you the real demographic information for Sweden. The red line is the birth rate, the number of births per year. The blue line is the death rate, how often people are dying, and the green line is the total population. In stage 1, pre-industrial Sweden had very high death rates and very high birth rates. High birth rates are valuable when you have a less developed economy because a lot of your money is going to come from farming. It's going to come from individual families producing material. So you want more kids to help you do more work. But we don't have any medical technology. We don't have antibiotics, all this. So the death rate is also typically very high in these early, less developed economies. As Sweden moves into stage 2, the transitional kind of area, we start getting some of those technologies that lead to a lower death rate. So the death rate drops off, but the birth rate remains high because the social value of children hasn't really changed. So families are still having a lot of kids. It's just that most of the kids are surviving now. So what happens to the total population? It skyrockets up, going through to stage 3, an industrial economy. This is where you get a lot of factory work and that kind of thing. And suddenly children are not as valuable per family. Like, they still have intrinsic value. You still get to pass on your values and you get to pass on your name and you get the joy of having a family and raising kids. But in terms of economic burden, children become more of a cost sink than a money maker for you in these economies. So people tend to have fewer children. Not no children, but maybe 1 or 2 where they may have before had 5 or 6. Then we start moving into the post-industrial economy, and the birth rate actually falls below the death rate again, and we actually see populations start to decrease. And this is what we call the demographic transition. So if we're concerned about population growth, one of the best things we can do is help less developed economies to develop themselves along. And then they become trade partners, so everyone kind of wins on that deal. Professor Klein, why are you talking about demography in a Biology 100 class? Well, this is our ecology section, and the simple fact is the more humans there are on the planet, the more ecological damage we do as a species. But before you jump up and you say, aha, so it's those less developed countries with their high population birth rates that are causing all of these ecological problems, let's talk about another concept, and that is the ecological footprint. Imagine for a moment that you live on an island, and this is a self-sufficient island, so everything you could possibly need is on this island. If you like watching TV from a couch, the materials for making that couch, the cotton for the fabric and the wood for the frame, that's all on this island. That has to be harvested from this island. If you like driving around your car, you're going to need mines in order to mine metal. You're going to need factories in order to produce materials. You're going to need gasoline refineries as well as oil fields in order to get that crude oil. So that is coming from this island. You're going to need places to grow your food. If you're a vegetarian, you're going to need a couple of acres in order to grow enough food for yourself. If you are a meat eater, you're going to need enough acres to grow the crops that you're going to then feed to your cattle, which will then need their own space as well. And you're probably not eating exclusively meat, so we might as well add some more fields for you to eat fruit and vegetables as well. So you're going to need substantially more space. How big of an island would you have to occupy before all of the requirements of your current lifestyle? You live exactly the same as you do now. How big would the island have to be in order to allow that to occur? That size is essentially your ecological footprint. It's the amount of space that you demand from the earth in terms of producing materials, making food, gasoline, travel, leisure, all these different things. And it is that demand on Earth's resources that actually does all of that ecological damage. So while 80% of the world's population lives in these less developed economies, they only use about 14% of global resources annually. 80% of the population uses 14% of the resources, whereas the richest countries in the world have 20% of the population, but they use 80% of the resources. It's a very popular proposed solution to ecological problems to simply limit human population growth. But limiting population growth alone is not going to solve the problem, because the real issue is overconsumption. People in developed countries have a much, much, much larger ecological footprint than people in less developed countries. In the United States, a place with very low population growth, Each person requires about 23 acres of space. That is their size of their ecological footprint on average. Now, lifestyle is a big factor in this. If you're a vegetarian, you have a smaller ecological footprint than your meat-eating counterpart. If you ride a bike to work, then you have a smaller ecological footprint than somebody who drives a gas guzzler. If you only buy one outfit every year, you have a smaller ecological footprint than someone who's shopping every single week. So the locations with the slowest population growth, you see the highest amount of consumption of resources, and the places with the most population, they actually use the fewest resources. So it's not just population growth, it's also consumption. We need to look at our lifestyle habits. On this graph, the number of individuals in a country, the population, is described on the x-axis, and the y-axis shows you the average footprint per person. Now, if you multiply the population by the average footprint, then you get the total footprint of that country. So the size of the rectangle that you see here is proportionate to the overall impact of that country. And you can see the United States has a very large rectangle, but places with much larger populations, for example, China and India, the two most populous countries on the planet, have a much smaller overall rectangle. Another way that you could approximate the ecological impact of a population is to calculate the amount of CO2 that they pump into the atmosphere. If you need some goods shipped to you from Amazon, well, obviously that burns gas to get there. But you also needed to run a factory in order to make those goods. That requires electricity. How do we make electricity? Well, sometimes we do it in coal-fired power plants, so that creates a lot of CO2. Basically, any activity in which we participate, we are generating CO2. So if you know how much CO2 the country is producing, you have a good idea of their overall environmental impact. And the reality is that the rate of consumption has been increasing even faster than the population growth rate. So again, it's consumption that's the problem. To see this animation scales the size of a country based on its overall CO2 emissions, starting in the way back of 1972, and then you can see how much CO2 emissions have increased in some areas, but not in others. You'll see that some countries become very large, whereas others remain shriveled up. Now you might notice that China and India blow up pretty large on this graph as well, but I'll remind you that they have over 1 billion people in population each, whereas the United States has only 327 million. That is, that the US population accounts for about 4.25% of the total world population, and yet we consume far more resources than any other country of our size. I'm not saying this to try to make you feel guilty for living in a developed country, just to frame the issue of human impact on the environment. Human population growth is absolutely a concern, but overconsumption is a bigger concern. And the largest problems could pop up in the areas where we have a large population and then they start consuming more resources. So take a look at India. India has about 1 billion people. The number of people living in India who do not have access to electricity, as in whatsoever, no electricity or cooking fuel at all, is larger than the entire population of the United States. Now, India is considering moving over to develop some coal-fired power plants because they have some of the largest coal reserves in the world. If that many people all start moving to burning coal, which is the most polluting form of electricity that we have, then that is going to be a really massive impact on the global climate. And then people say, oh, India, don't do that. Coal is bad. Don't make all of those coal-fired power plants. But the rub is that coal is cheap. It's an extremely cheap power source, and India does not have a lot of resources. And we're the country with the largest GDP in the world, and we haven't moved over to a completely renewable energy sector. We don't use as much solar as we should. We don't use as much wind as we should. Wind power has incredible potential in the United States. We haven't even moved over to nuclear, which has a lot of advantages over a lot of these other forms of power. And that's not to say nuclear is perfect, it's got its own problems, but again, if you want to hear me talk about that, humans and the environment. So if we haven't made this transition and we are in the best position to use renewable energy sources, how can we really tell these less developed economies that no, you can't make the same mistakes we did, you can't use this cheap power source? You should build the infrastructure for renewable energy that we ourselves haven't even invested in. For decades, the United States has been a world leader. What we do, the rest of the world kind of follows. And if we are turning our back on renewables, well, the rest of the world will follow our lead. Jeez, this video ended up being a bummer. Tell you what, here's a video of Edward being 115% done with everything. Enjoy!